Comencem la següent ponència. Per mi és un plaer i un honor poder presentar el doctor Fred Wulczyn. Ell és un reputat investigador del Centre de Recerca Chapin Hall de la Universitat de Chicago. El Fred Wulczyn col·labora i assessora diferents projectes internacionals i és director del Center State Foster Care and Adoption Data i col·labora també amb l'American Public Human Services Association. Ha rebut també nombrosos premis i reconeixements al llarg de la seva trajectòria investigadora, però a part de la seva tasca investigadora, ell és un reconegut expert en l'anàlisi de dades de l'administració pública. De fet, va ser l'arquitecte de la creació d'una base de dades multiestatal sobre el sistema de protecció als Estats Units i també va construir una base de dades integrada per fer el seguiment dels serveis de protecció a la infància a l'estat d'Illinois. És una base de dades que actualment i després de 25 anys encara s'està utilitzant. Llavors, aquestes bases de dades van significar un punt d'inflexió en el sistema perquè van donar l'oportunitat a l'administració pública d'analitzar els resultats que estava produint el sistema de protecció, comparar resultats també a través de diferents estats, diferents jurisdiccions, proposar i avaluar millores, etc. També en el context de l'administració pública va desenvolupar la primera proposta per canviar una llei federal sobre la protecció a la infància que limitava d'alguna manera els estats al fet de poder impulsar programes d'innovació i va proposar una alternativa per poder finançar aquests programes innovadors anomenat waiver programs que va permetre d'alguna manera reformar programes i pràctiques que s'estaven utilitzant fins aleshores. Per tant, introduir elements de millora dintre del sistema a través d'aquesta proposta alternativa de finançament. En definitiva, jo el que vull és destacar la seva expertesa en la millora de l'efectivitat i de l'optimització de les polítiques públiques dirigides a la infància i a l'adolescència en situació de vulnerabilitat. I avui precisament ens parlarà d'això, de com poder fer polítiques més eficients i optimitzar recursos i programes intentant trobar espais i escletxes dintre del sistema per millorar i innovar el sistema de protecció en general. Moltes gràcies, Fred, per la teva presència i escoltarem amb atenció la teva intervenció.
Thank you, Laura. Is that okay? Well, first of all, let me say thank you to Laura and Fina for inviting me here. I think the best way to describe some of the work that I do, maybe not all of the work that I do, is sort of pots and pans research. When you go to a restaurant, you have a nice meal, everybody comments about the good food, but people rarely talk about the pots and pans that were used to make the meal. But it's very hard to be a good cook without good pots and pans. And so the issue of money in the child welfare system, how it's spent, why it's spent, is something that's on everybody's mind, but it rarely gets much attention with respect to how it affects what gets done. And so I want to talk today about these sort of fundamental issues. It's a little bit hard to come at the very end of a long day where people have been talking about very important practice issues, talking about the lives of young people, to come back and talk about something as potentially mundane as how we spend money, but yet it's very important, much like a good set of pots and pans are to the quality of what we're able to do. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and I think mostly to try and find a way to provide practitioners, policymakers, the language needed to have a conversation about fiscal policy. And so if I'm successful today, you'll leave here with maybe a little bit more interest in fiscal policy, how money is spent, why money is spent, move you a little bit beyond maybe the traditional ways of thinking about those issues in the interest of pursuing greater flexibility over the expenditures of resources. So I'll tell you a little bit about my experience. I'm going to talk about what essentially is what I would regard as public sector finance. As I mentioned, I'll create a language about that, talk about different approaches that are commonly used in the United States and may well be used here. I want to talk specifically about the impact of funding on outcomes. I think everybody understands that money is used to purchase services, and those services have outcomes, but I think there's a deeper structural relationship between the money and the outcomes that if we don't pay attention to it, we might not create as much leverage in the system as we might. I'll talk a little bit about alternative approaches, and then maybe we'll have some time to talk about perspectives from around the world. So my experience starts off, I was a practitioner for 4 years, interested in the issues of the transition of young people and adults to the community. These were not young people or adults in the child welfare system. These were young people in the mental health and the developmental disabilities systems. When I started my career in the United States, we were moving away from institutional care into community-based care, and my job was to keep recently transitioned young people and adults in the community as opposed to back in the institution. And by and large, the rationale for doing that was better care in the community and care at lower cost. And those experiences had a tremendous impact on my thinking in the sense that there was a promise made that the money that was used to pay for institutional care would go to support care in the community, and those dollars did not flow in the same measure as the investment in institutional care. And as a consequence, that system became very brittle, very fragile, and didn't work as well as it might have. So I did that for 4 years after I got out of college. And then when I got out of graduate school, I worked in the government for 10 years as a policy analyst. There I learned, as a practitioner, I didn't really want to think about the money. Money was something that other people worried about. I wanted to improve practice. But one of the things that I learned during my time in government from a textbook that I read in graduate schools about formal and informal power structures in complex organizations. And one of the ways the author of the book talked about identifying informal power structures is that when you're in a meeting with leadership and you walk out of the meeting, look behind to see who stays in the room. And when I would go to budget meetings in the Department of Social Services in New York, we would, in every August, we would have to prepare a budget package for the coming fiscal year for the governor. The governor would then propose that, the legislature would pass the governor's proposals or not, but our job in August was to begin the process of preparing those proposals. And every year, at the end of the summer, we went to meet with the budget officials and present the proposal for the investments in programs, interventions, policy, so on and so forth. And in time, I would turn around when leaving the room and look to see who was left behind. And there were always two people left behind, the lawyers and the budget officials. The lawyers were there to tell the commissioner, you can do that because it's legal, or you can't do that because it's illegal. And the budget officials were there to say, you can't do that because you can't afford it, or you can do that because you can afford it. And it occurred to me that all of the work that we did in creating logical, programmatic responses to the need that we perceived were really left to the discretion of somebody who was going to say to the commissioner, yes, you can afford that, or no, you can't. And so it became apparent to me that as someone interested in program, you needed to understand the fiscal consequences of your ideas. That if you were going to be an effective advocate for what you wanted to do programmatically, you had to understand the world in the way a budget maker sees the world, and they do not see the world the way you do. But there is a way to translate the world as you see it into the world as they see it, but that argument has to be very carefully put together. And so I'm going to talk today about putting arguments together so that you can talk to budget officials when the time comes to advocate for a program. So in those years, I became interested in three basic questions. How do you fund need? In my job as a community caseworker, I was working on my master's degree, working on a master's thesis, or getting ready to think about a master's thesis, when the director of the agency came to me and said, we've just gotten a memorandum, and I worked in a rural county in Pennsylvania, we've just gotten a memorandum from the state mental health office that says this is how we are going to fund mental health services for young people and adults. And he was of the mind that the formula being used advantaged large urban areas and disadvantaged small rural counties. And as I looked at the indicators, none of the things they were using to allocate resources was true about the people I served. And these were people who had deep and important mental health issues. So I couldn't see a connection between the policy that the state was pursuing and the local expression of need as I experienced it as a caseworker. So I became interested in the question of, well, how do you allocate resources in alignment with need? And so I started work on that, and at another time we can talk about how that affected my thinking. But the second question is, how do you align social policy with fiscal policy? And that question came up in the context of New York when I went to work for New York State in 1986. There were 27,000 children in out-of-home care. By 1989, 3 years later, there were 65,000 children in out-of-home care. So from 27,000 to 60,000, 65,000 in 3 years' time. Huge, enormous increase in the number of children in out-of-home care for a variety of reasons. Some of it had to do with substance abuse. Some of it had to do with policy changes that led to kids entering care. But it became apparent that at 65,000 children, the state was unwilling to support a population that large. The biggest part of the population was in New York City. They had 50,000 children in out-of-home care. To give you an idea of where that system has come in the time since then, 20 years later, there are now fewer than 10,000 children in out-of-home care. So it's gone from 50,000 to 10,000 in 20 years' time. It went from, in New York City, it went from 17 to 50,000 in 3 years' time. So the growth and decline in those cycles became very important because the policy was to shrink the system, but the money was locked into keeping the system at the same size. So how do you align the fiscal mechanisms with the social policy of shrinking the system? So that became an important question. And a related question to that is managing the incentives. The misalignment in much of the United States is around the fact that it's relatively easy to fund out-of-home care and relatively more difficult to fund prevention, or for kids who are leaving care to fund services when a child returns to care, or when a child's been adopted, or when a child is in a guardianship outside the system. It's relatively easier. Things have changed since I began my career somewhat, but it's relatively easier to finance out-of-home care and relatively harder to fund services to families who need intervention, but not necessarily out-of-home care. So there was a dynamic in the incentives built into the way the system was set up that created fiscal policy moving in one direction, social policy moving in another, and trying to resolve those tensions in a way that was productive from both from the perspective of the alignment between social and fiscal policy. So, and again, these are circumstances that are changing in the United States, but much of the system is financed on what's called a fee-for-service system, particularly if you're a provider of out-of-home care. So a fee-for-service system says if you provide a day of foster care, you can submit the bill to the government and the government will pay the bill. The service was foster care, and you get a certain fee for providing foster care. And one of the first things you want to ask yourself in the current context is how many of your services or what parts of the service system are funded through fees for service. Because fee-for-service systems have particular characteristics that are hard to align with policies, particularly if the policies are intended to reduce the impact of out-of-home care on children and families in preference to serving kids in their families, in their communities. So if you have a fee-for-service system and you're trying to move towards more community-based services, it may be difficult to do that in a fee-for-service system. So what do I mean? So this is an example of a state where we are working to change the fiscal dynamics. And all I've done here is to show at the aggregate level how much money will be spent in this fee-for-service system under the assumption that the state doesn't make any investments in alternative services. So the state policy might say, I'd like to invest more money in prevention, keep kids out of care. We're not making any assumptions about new policies in that regard. And this is a reasonable estimate of what that state is likely to expend, and it's roughly $12 million a year, and the number of kids in the out-of-home care system in this particular region within a state is roughly 700 kids. So for these 700 kids, the state's going to spend $12 million per year. Now, somebody might come along and say, well, that's more children in out-of-home care than we should have. We should have fewer kids in out-of-home care. So what we're going to do is we're going to invest $500,000 a year for 5 years to reduce the number of kids in out-of-home care. So that's $2.5 million we're going to add to the system so that we don't have to rely so much on foster care. That sounds like a good deal. Except that if it works, so we've reduced admissions in this case of teenagers. As you can see here now, the orange line at the top was the baseline expenditure expectation. It's what we thought we were going to spend if nobody did anything. The red line below that is how much we are going to spend on foster care if we're actually successful at reducing the utilization of out-of-home care by 50 children each and every year. So for $500,000 a year, we're going to try and in this particular population, they're admitting roughly 400 children per year to the system. And we're going to try to reduce that to it's 340 kids, and we're going to try to reduce that to 287 kids. So we're not trying to, it's not necessarily per se a big impact, but we're trying to reduce it because that's public policy says we should reduce the size of our foster care population. So the difference between those two lines from a dollar spent perspective is the blue line at the bottom. And you can see that over time, there's a slight increase in the amount of money we're not spending on foster care. So the net effect of that is to not increase the capacity of the system to deliver services, because on the one hand, we're increasing expenditures by $2.5 million for preventive services, but we're saving on foster care well over $5.5 million. So the system is actually going to shrink by $3 million in total spending. Now, politicians may want to shrink the system by more than, by $3 million. But as advocates, we might want to keep the system at the same size, the same amount of revenue that we would have spent on foster care, plus the $2.5 million. Now we're growing the system. So the question is, how do we grow the system rather than shrink the system through our good intentions? Because the loss of revenue will hurt the providers, particularly if they're NGOs. The NGOs will become smaller. And so what that sets up is a dynamic that says the more successful the state is at achieving its social policy goals, the more difficult it is for NGOs to succeed. So public sector success and NGO difficulties go hand in hand when you're operating a fee-for-service system. So that's the question of how do we rid ourselves of that dynamic, and what are the policy choices that we have to take on. So there are some general questions that define the way we typically think about child welfare policy. So the most common question is, how can we get more services to more people? Much less often do we think about the question, how does the way we pay for services affect the services we provide? And I'll argue that under certain circumstances, that third question is more important than how can we get more services to more people? It's either one or two questions depending upon how you're counting. And then I think the question, a secondary question is, what can we do to improve outcomes, and how does improving outcomes affect the quality of care or the ability to deliver an effective package of services? And that goes to the point I made a moment ago, which is that you have this conflict between doing better and getting weaker at the same time. And we should have fiscal policy that strengthens the service delivery system, not weakens it under conditions of success. So that's the argument that I want to make. And then you see that last point made there again. So what's the path we ought to take? So the first thing I want to do is to try and put this into a context that might be a little bit more well-connected to experiences that you're having. I know it's an experience I had not so long ago. And that's to ask the question, what would a good father and mother do when you send your child to college? Right? That's a big issue in the United States because college is not free. You got to pay a lot of money. And part of the cost of college is, how do you support the child in a dormitory or an apartment? You have to deal with food, clothing, shelter, and expenses, not to mention tuition, and so on and so forth. And so the question is, how am I going to manage these expenses? And the conversation I have with my children, or had with my children, Mark's probably had the conversation with his kids, but the question is, okay, I'm going to help support you, but I'm not going to support anything you do. I'm going to support some of the things you are going to do. And so we're going to sit down and figure out what's an eligible expense. Right? So I'll give you my credit card, and every month you send me the bill, and I'll look through the bill and I'll say, oh, I'll pay for that, I'll pay for that, I'm not going to pay for that because that's not part of the deal. And we'll go on and we'll have this conversation back and forth every month, every month, every month. And so there are eligible expenses that I will pay for without question. Right? So the first semester goes by, that works out pretty well. But the second semester or the second year comes along, and my daughters, they're not dummies. They weren't, it's not their first rodeo. They know dad is a softie in some respects. So they start figuring out, well, if I call, I really want the New York Times every day. But that wasn't part of the original deal. But he is going to pay for books. So I'm going to call the New York Times an educational expense. Right? And then the next year it's not just the New York Times, it's some magazine, because that's educational. And so we wind up having conversations over time that are more, she's trying to expand the services or the things that I'll pay for, and I'm trying to shrink them down, because if it's a legitimate expense, I've said I'll pay for it, right? So she's trying to figure out how to expand that list, and I'm trying to figure out. And so now you can imagine the conversation back and forth every year gets more contentious as she tries to make it bigger, and I'm trying to make it smaller. She's angry at me, I'm angry at her, and the conversation goes on. Until finally one of us figures out, you know what? I'm going to give you a fixed amount. I'm going to give you $500 a month, $200 a month. I don't care what you spend it on. Just don't come back for more, right? If you decide you're happy, spending that money going to the movies, go to the movies. You're on your own. But don't come back to me at the end of the month saying I ran out of money. Because the deal was, I'll give you the money, you can spend it on whatever you want, just don't go over. Or if you do go over, we have to talk about what we're going to do about that. So that's a situation in the U.S. that goes on all the time between the states and the federal government, maybe less so with the NGOs than the public agencies that they contract, but this contentious debate between what's allowable, the covered services, and the covered populations, right? So I had 3 daughters. They were all covered. By the time I got to the 3rd daughter, I had figured out, you know, although she was a much better negotiator than my first 2. The negotiations are very much the same in the U.S. as people try to expand the covered services and the covered populations. I'm living with my boyfriend. I think he should have the benefit. No, he's not a member of the covered population. I'm not paying for anything for the boyfriend. And if I find out he's living with you, that's going to be a bad thing. So, at least while they're in college. And this for me, this is ancient history. My kids are all out of college, and we survive. But for the parent in these negotiations, the question is, what's the risk? What am I exposed to? For the young person, what am I exposed to? Or in the case of NGOs and the public sector, what are our risks? So what I want to talk about is a language that allows us to sort of expose the issues that are in play here so that people can participate in a conversation about social and fiscal policy in an effort to bring them into closer alignment with each other. So let's just talk a little bit about social policy and fiscal policy. I think we can have a more detailed conversations about this, but effectively social policy says who will receive the government's help. So a lot of the conversation has been about expanding foster care to young people beyond the age of 18. That's expanding the covered population. We might think about expanding into in the case of welfare, changing the income eligibility criteria. In the case of the federal government, it only reimburses for foster care for some kids. So there's an interest in expanding federal reimbursement for foster care to a larger population, a larger covered population. There's also then questions about why are they eligible, because that will speak to the kinds of programs that get funded, because we're trying to create remedies to the eligible populations. That affects what services will be provided and then what outcomes we have in mind. So what's the covered population? What are the covered services? Why are we providing them? And what do we expect? The minister earlier today talked about the need for a return on that investment. And that is, what outcomes do we have in mind as it relates to the question of why do we have social policy targeting a particular a group of people in our society. Fiscal policy is a little bit different. It speaks to the question of what resources will we appropriate? How much money are we going to spend? And the last question is a little bit more important and gets a little bit less attention, but then it also speaks to how are we going to distribute the money? On what basis will I take $1 and reimburse someone downstream from the government? On what basis will I make a payment? So in fee-for-service systems, the most common thing that you have to have in order to get money from the government is a claim. I provided foster care. Here's the proof. I claim payment. With the claim, the money will flow. That's the principal mechanism of exchange in a fee-for-service system. But there are other ways to disperse funds, and that's an important part of fiscal policy, again, that we speak less about, increasingly more common in the U.S., but the alignment of social policy is really around how do we support the covered population, the covered services, with fiscal policy that gives us the greatest flexibility to meet the needs of young people, and how do we use the mechanism of payment to support that social policy. In the US, I don't know if it's a term that's used here, but we talk about silos of funding. With this silo, I can pay for this service. The client may need another service, but I can't provide that service because that service is not covered by that silo. And so I have to figure out a way to either call that service something that fits in the silo, much like the conversation with my daughters. I have to manipulate the definition of the service into the silo, or I'm not able to provide the service. And so we'd like the system to spend less time on those negotiations so that services are more flexibly administered. Okay, so we've already talked about much of this. The one thing that we haven't talked about is this question of risk, and I'll say more about that in a minute. But one of the things that happens when you change from a fee-for-service mechanism to some alternative mechanism is that the question of risk comes to the fore. Because one of the things that happens is that we move risk around. And I'll talk a little bit more about what risk is, but I want to highlight it at this point because we'll spend some time on that. But in order to understand risk, we sort of have to decompose or take apart the way finances ultimately work. So, I've already talked about much of this. I can't really see it. Yeah, that's fine. So the traditional method I've talked about already, the covered population. The main thing about expanding the covered population and covered services is that they require more money. If you're going to increase both covered services and covered populations, that's why much of the conversation around fiscal reform is about asking for more money. It's because you're trying to change the covered population and the covered services. The newer perspective doesn't rule out the possibility of asking for more money, but it does raise the possibility that what we're going to do is change the rules under which the money that I am already getting can be spent. So there's two branches of fiscal reform, and so I'm interested in how these newer perspectives can be brought to bear. You'll hear various ways of talking about these kinds of strategies, block grants, capitated funding, blended funding. We'll talk about those in greater detail in a moment. So the basic model behind every financial mechanism, and I think it's important to bear in mind that the basics of funding programs are the same regardless of how you do it. And in fact, in a perfectly efficient system, the differences in the two models that I'll talk to you about, there is no difference because they're perfectly efficient. A perfectly efficient system produces just enough revenue, no more, no less, to get people what they need, when they need it, for as long as they need it, and of the kind they need. Now, we don't operate such systems yet, but the important thing to realize is that in such a system, these differences, these models are not per se different in the results that they produce from a financial perspective. So we want to keep track of three ideas. That to understand finance at the most basic level, you only need to maintain or keep in mind three issues. So the first is units of service. We're going to call that quantity. How much service are you going to provide? And the quantity is a function of two things. How many people do you let in, and how long do they stay? So that one construct breaks down into two: admissions and how long or how many. In the case of foster care, how long do they stay? In the case of mental health services, how many hours of therapy on average do they get? Okay? That's the first building block of a fiscal analysis. The second building block, well, let me just say a little bit more about that. Oh, no, that's fine. So in the case of out-of-home care, I already mentioned one day in out-of-home care. Preventive services, it's 1 hour of parenting class. For post-permanency services, it's 1 hour of mental health care so that a child doesn't come back into out-of-home care. It's affected by the number of new children. and the average number of units each person gets. That makes sense. Then there's the cost of providing a unit of service, or the price. And that's affected, or that's made up of administration. What does it cost to administer a program? So that's executive directors, program managers, the cost of the people who are not case-carrying personnel. Then there's the cost of infrastructure, buildings, computers, so on and so forth. And then there is the labor associated with delivering the intervention. Caseworker time, therapist time, but that's essentially what goes into the price of a unit of service. So what does 1 day of foster care cost? What does 1 hour of a parenting class cost? That's the price. So, three ideas: quantity, price, and once you have quantity and price, you know expenditures or revenue. So most fiscal offices are trying to predict over the course of a year how many people are going to be eligible to receive a service in this fiscal year, and how many units of service are they going to get, and what's the cost of a unit of service. If you tell me what that is, I can tell you how much money will be expended. And that's true no matter how you come up with a mechanism. Once you calculate, from the government's perspective, it's revenue. It's how much money I have to, or expenditure, I guess depends on the way you think about it, but how much money I have to let out. And then from an NGO's perspective is, I'm going to get this much money over the course of the year. How am I going to expend that? How much money am I going to get? I'm going to get a figure that matches up price and quantity. So price and quantity, we want to just take into account the fact that they will vary with a couple of things. So there's not just one price or one quantity. In particular, for example, children with mental health needs will require specialized services, so they're going to, on a unit cost basis, cost more than a child that has no such needs. And neighborhoods with higher poverty rates might have greater demand for the services that you're providing. So the price and quantity will vary with need, whether it's at the community level or at the person level. So you have to bear those two things in mind. But at the end of the day, price and quantity are going to yield revenue or expenditures, again, depending upon how you think about it. Traditional approaches to fiscal reform focus on quantity and to a lesser extent on price. So when foster parents or advocates ask for a cost of living adjustment to the stipend they receive as foster parents, that affects the price, not the quantity. When we talk about expanding services, we're talking about the quantity of the services. And then when we look at introducing evidence-based interventions, we might be influencing the price of services because it changes what people do. It changes how long it takes to do the work. It could shorten it. It could lengthen it. But we're affecting the price when we think about evidence-based interventions because it touches what people do. So when we introduce these kinds of ideas, we have to think about its effect on price. And then the incentives in this system. So if you see there at the bottom, it says expenditures and revenue are equal to price times quantity. And in a traditional fee-for-service system, when you start the fiscal year, now you have to start thinking about the dynamics that underlie this kind of a system. So if you provide a service, I will reimburse you. So now think about this from the beginning of the fiscal year perspective. I don't know how much I'm going to spend over the course of the year. If you have a contract with the government, you generally know what the price will be for the service you're going to provide. But what you don't know is the quantity. So the quantity becomes the unknown and therefore the thing that gets managed. You're going to aggressively manage quantity in a fee-for-service system, and the incentive is to provide more because it yields greater revenue. There's not an incentive to provide less because providing less lowers revenue. And if you're an NGO, you start the year with a certain number of staff, rental agreements on your buildings, so on and so forth. So you're not really in a position to lower revenue because you have obligations in the form. And the one thing that one thing the public sector needs from the NGOs is a stable NGO that has high quality staff, keeps their staff on the job, trained well, sends them to conferences so that they learn about the latest things. All that costs money. So those fixed costs and to some extent the variable costs mean that there is no incentive really to manage quantity down in the course of a fiscal year. And that becomes a very important defining feature of a fee-for-service system from a fiscal planning perspective. And again, it's set up because at the beginning of the year, we have a pretty good idea of what we can charge for a service we provide, but we don't know the quantity. And because we don't know the quantity, we don't know how much money is going to come to our agency, except for projections that we may have made. So that's what we would call a retrospective fiscal calculation. You don't know what you're going to get until the end of the year. Because at the end of the year, you'll finally know how much you actually provided. So we're looking backwards. So I've maybe one slide ahead of myself here. The price is known mostly. The quantity is unknown at the beginning of the year, although budget offices will project quantity so that they have a revenue estimate. And you can see here, I can't use that to highlight the screen, but the incentive is to manage quantity and at least hold it stable. And the main problem is that in these kinds of systems, there's a tendency to fund inefficiency, to not try to get better, because getting better means reducing the volume of services you provide generally. Unless you can compensate by increasing, remember I said it was two parts, admissions and duration. If you want to maintain the quantity and duration is going down, volume has to go up. If your duration is going up, then you can afford to admit fewer people. But it's that dynamic that creates the disincentives that we have to understand in the system, and the relationship between those and outcomes. So the next, the alternative to retrospective fiscal systems are prospective fiscal systems. And the only difference is, what do you know at the beginning of the year and what do you know at the end of the year? And in a prospective system, the price is that should be known, not unknown. The price is known. So at the beginning of the fiscal year, you know roughly what the price is. The quantity, is that the same slide? That is the same slide.
It's prospective, this one.
Yeah, no, I know, but
But
yeah, it's wrong.
Yeah.
It's wrong.
Yeah.
So what's known in a prospective system, what's known at the beginning of the year is revenue. Because what we're going to say is, this is how much revenue you can expect to get at the beginning of the year. So it's much like me saying to my daughters, I'm going to spend this much money for you over the course of the year. We know that now. And in exchange for taking that, you have flexibility to manage the price of the things that you buy and the quantity of the things that you buy. So now the price and quantity are relatively unknown because I have fixed the revenue. So if the revenue is fixed, I can only buy so many units at a price. I can lower the price and raise the number of units, or I can lower the number of units and raise the price. So you can see how the dynamics are different in one system versus the other, and we want to recognize the differences in those dynamics as we develop the ideas. So here's the recap. So in the retrospective, the red is what's unknown. And in the prospective system, the red is what's unknown. And the differences between those two models are, by and large, the main differences in the way budget offices approach the problem of allocating resources. And so when I talk about the mechanism of allocating resources, I'm talking about one or the other of these models as the primary mechanism. In the prospective payment system, I'll say, this is how much money you have for the year. Spend it wisely. In the retrospective system, I don't know how much money you're going to be able to claim. You're going to determine that over the course of the year, and at the end of the year, we will reconcile the books, as it were. It's important to note here that in a retrospective system, quantity is managed with an incentive to overserve because it drives revenue. If I have 100 units of service at $1 a day or $1 a service, that's $100 over the course of the year. But if I manage to provide 150, then my revenue goes up by 50 days, $50. In a prospective system, the incentive is to underserve. And so those dynamics have to be weighed in a very carefully in relationship to what the end point is. So risk in retro and prospective payment models. So risk refers to your exposure to the unwanted. So each model has risk embedded in it. There's no such thing as a risk-free relationship with a funder. The questions are more about who holds the risk and what are you going to do if the risk you're trying to avoid arises nonetheless. And so risk is distributed through the payment model and the assumptions that are made. If I say to you, here's how much money you have for the year, who has the risk? The provider, the NGO, because this is how much you have. If you make decisions and those decisions don't work out, and that's all the money I get, then who bears that risk? The provider. In a fee-for-service system, who bears the risk? The funder, because I don't have any control over the decisions you make, and if the quantity goes up or down, depending upon, again, the contractual arrangement, if I thought you would spend provide 100 units of service over the course of the year, and you wind up paying, using 150, unless I have a cap, I'm exposed to the 150 units of services that you provided. So in a fee-for-service system, the funder bears a significant risk. In a prospective system, the provider may bear a significant risk. So both systems have risk built into them. They have mechanisms for managing risk, and the job of fiscal and social policy is to come up with an equitable scheme for managing risk. Not eliminating risk, because that can't happen, but managing risk is what we want to try and do. And it's important to bear in mind that some risk is more volatile than others. And so the risk-sharing arrangement may differ depending upon the underlying volatility of the risk. So what are the risks? What could go wrong? We go back to price, quantity, and on quantity, number of kids coming in, and how long do they stay. So it's very hard to predict year over year how many kids are going to need your service. So that's subject to volatility. Economic downturn. Right now in certain parts of the U.S. we have a methamphetamine problem that's causing lots of kids to come into out-of-home care. If I made a certain projection relating to how many kids I thought you were going to admit, and then all of a sudden a drug epidemic sweeps through my community, and I go from, I expected 100 admissions, but instead I got 150, and I capped your allocation. What do I do? What do I do with the extra 50 that I had? It has nothing to do with the quality of services that I provided. It has to do with an external set of events that are driving up demand, and that can happen quickly, and it can be a large swing in the demand. And so, how do I manage that particularly volatile risk? Unit price is less volatile. There's less risk involved with the price of producing a unit of service, because you know year over year the cost of heating a building, you know the cost of your labor, and so on and so forth. So that's less volatile year over year, although there are conditions when labor costs can change that are related to the clinical acuity of kids. So you have to bear that in mind. But there is some there's more predictability as it relates to labor costs. And so we want to understand each contributing factor to the notion of risk so that we can equitably share the risk. Again, right now, the risks are built into the system, and one of the reasons why the government, particularly in the U.S., fights with the states about, I don't want to pay for that service, I don't want to pay for that services, is because they're exposed to the risk that states are spending money and sending the government the bill, and the government wants to shut down their exposure to the risk of decisions on the part of the state. So that's not a good risk-sharing arrangement from the perspective of the state, and it's not a good risk-sharing arrangement from the perspective of the provider, because what it causes the state to do is to shrink the kinds of services you're allowed to buy. So it makes it more difficult to meet the needs of kids because of the risk-sharing relationship. So it has consequences for the other party, the nature of the risk I have as a funder. So in the case of the risk to the public sector, again, I mentioned some of these. It's easy to control price-based risks. It's harder to control quantity-based risks. You seek control through reconciliation. You set rules. You have silos. You determine what's allowable and what's not allowable. And then it's hard to control expenditure risks driven by the decisions of an NGO. For the state or the government to control in the current retrospective systems. In a prospective system, the risks shift to price and quantity to the provider. As I said, there is a risk of underserving. There are risks to quality, and revenue risk is reduced. Now, in a fee-for-service system, what's one of the big risks that's faced by the provider? What happens if the government decides to stop referring clients to you in the current system? Just say, we're not sending anybody your way anymore. That's a big risk that providers face right now. And so what do you do in that situation in terms of maintaining your viability? If all of a sudden the government decides we don't want your services anymore, that's a risk. That's a huge risk. We tend not to think about it in fiscal conversations as a risk, but I'm sure the executive managers of agencies worry every day about whether or not they're going to sustain the number of referrals that they've used to build into their budget to create a fiscal projection that says over the course of the year we're going to be able to balance our books. So that admission risk is a big one, and so when I talk about risks shifting around, and it seems like some of these risks are a big burden for NGOs, I would only remind you that you already have major risks in the way you're related, the way you relate to the public sector. The risk to the NGO, again, I seem to get ahead of myself here. The volume risks, no referrals. The price risk, unfair reimbursement. So generally, providers are asking the government to reimburse the full cost of services, but oftentimes that does not happen. And so the difference has to be made up, or there's reduction in quality of care. And there, of course, is a revenue risk associated with the other two. And there are risks associated with improving the quality of care. It's very hard to improve the quality of care if quality of care affects the volume of services that you provide. So why would that happen? Well, in the context of the United States, one of the ways that they're trying to improve the quality of care is, for example, improving the skills of foster parents to deal with the behavior of young people in care, and that when foster parents get better at managing behavior, it has a number of effects. It reduces the use of group care because placements are more stable, and then because placements are more stable, kids go home faster. So I might be interested in investing in the skills of my foster parent. The skills of the foster parent might lead to fewer placement disruptions, less use of congregate care, and shorter length of stay. Both of those have adverse fiscal consequences for an NGO. That's a risk. Quality improvement is a risk in a fee-for-service system. Shouldn't be that way. In a prospective payment system, there are risks associated with volume if demand goes up, and there are decision risks whenever the focus shifts from providing a service to providing an outcome. Because one of the things that happens in a shift to a prospective payment system is the shift is away from providing a service to delivering an outcome. If you make decisions intending to improve outcomes and they don't improve outcomes, then you have a risk of not reducing time in care or not reducing the use of residential care, and that will lead to a higher rate of expenditure inside the budget box that was created. It's a little hard to see. I just wanted to talk a little bit about services to improve outcomes. On the volume risks, we can think of those as preventive services. They're meant to keep kids out of care. It includes things in the U.S. like nurse-family partnerships, parenting interventions, substance abuse treatment. Providing those things keep kids out of foster care. Permanency, getting kids home, adoptions, guardianships, services meant to increase the likelihood that a child will be able to go home. And then unit cost risks are associated with things like using more family-based care, less residential care. So these are the decisions that providers are making in terms of interventions that are closely related to the fiscal model. If you're trying to keep kids out, you're going to affect volume. If you're trying to get kids home faster, you're going to affect duration. If you're trying to get kids to stay in families, you're going to affect the unit cost of care. And that's all wound up in the decisions you make about the services you provide, and you have to understand their fiscal consequences in the context of how your agency is set up. What time are we doing? How time?
5 minutes?
Yeah. We'll have, let's just go right to the conclusions. So I think the main message that I'd like you to go away with as you think about sort of fiscal reform in your context is that success has a price in a fee-for-service system. And I described the price earlier on, that success actually shrinks the total amount of money available to serve children and families. Again, it's not always as straightforward, but I think from the perspective of, as you think about these things, you might be very excited about a $1 million, a $2 million, a $10 million, a $25 million investment in trying to keep kids in out-of-home care, or keep kids from entering out-of-home care. But at the end of the day, if it has the effect you want it to have, it may actually result in the system getting smaller, less resources, and there's a social policy, social value judgment that has to be made as to whether or not that's actually a good outcome. I would argue that in many cases, we want to keep the system as large as it is, just spend money differently. And so success has a price. The cost of success, in particular for NGOs in a fee-for-service system, is particularly high. That the revenue available to NGOs will get smaller and smaller the more and more successful they are, and that is a problem. The cost of success, in a manner of speaking, for the public sector is low in a fee-for-service system. So there's an imbalance in the consequences of success for the public and the private sector as it relates to operating in a fee-for-service world. There are models to manage the cost of success, but you have to be very deliberate in the way you go about setting those models up, and particularly as it relates to this issue of risk. What are you going to do? Because in a prospective payment system, what you're predicting what the future is going to look like and making decisions on that basis. The risk, of course, is what happens if the predictions are wrong, which prediction is wrong, and who bears the risk are the big policy choices in when we think about moving away from fee-for-service systems to some alternative way of managing the budgets or the revenue profile. And stronger systems are going to depend on effective management of resources, particularly as it relates to the bottom line. Again, the point, in some respects, the point here is we don't want success to shrink the system, particularly if in doing so what we're essentially saying is I'm not serving the child in their home and community because the need for services has gone away. I'm serving the child in the home and the community because the possibility of meeting the need in that setting has improved because of clinical technology, the quality of care. I no longer need to meet that need in foster care. I can meet the need at home. So need's not going away. As long as need doesn't go away, let's not unwittingly shrink the system. Because if we can maintain the system at roughly its same size, then we can serve more children, we can make investments in higher quality care. But if the fiscal model were tied to continually shrinks the resources we have, the more successful we are, eventually the shrinking will stand in the way of more success. And that's a dynamic we should seek to avoid at all possible, pardon the pun, at all possible costs. So I'll stop there and see if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Fred. Hi ha alguna pregunta, algun comentari? Tenim encara 5 minutets que els podem dedicar a contestar preguntes que tingueu.
You need the microphone.
The microphone.
Here the challenge, nevertheless, is evidence that not doing nothing, and if we let the system shrink, it has another cost, because of course most of the politicians can think, okay, I'm not going to put children in care, so it's a way to save money. But at the end, you will pay more money in other ways, in economy, in the crimes, etc. So, how do you evidence that?
So that's a really important question, because the political realities are that generally social services, governments are trying to spend less money on social services overall. And at the end of the day, a sound fiscal arrangement between the government and the NGO sector is only as good as the commitment to maintaining the resources. And we've been involved in a number of situations where even though the fiscal models were set up to preserve revenue in the system, when budget cycles are such, the economy turns down, there's less tax revenue coming into to the government, it becomes hard to sustain the investment in these more flexible prospective funding systems. On the other hand, those political choices will be made under either circumstance. And I think it becomes a question of how do we, as practitioners, agency heads, how as a community do we come to understand the fiscal consequences of the decisions being made so that we can advocate effectively and transparently about the impact of decisions that are being made and the consequences of those where there's a presumption of success or services are being reduced and the price being paid is an unfair price. So I think by unpacking, the best thing that we can, the advocate community and the provider community can do is encourage an open and transparent exchange of the impact of decisions. The government will then ultimately do what it's supposed to do, which is make difficult choices in a world of competing demands. But the more we can come to terms with the language that we use, understand the dynamics, I think the better our chances are of having outcomes that are more favorable. And that, I think, has been my experience in terms of working with both the public and the private sector on these kinds of approaches. Pots and pans.
Si no hi ha més intervencions, doncs ho deixem aquí. Ara donarem pas al tancament de la jornada i una mica portarem les conclusions.